Hello and welcome to this Easter special on Philosophy for All. Today we're joined by a very special guest, Dr. Andrew Loke. He is an associate professor at Hong Kong Baptist University and is an elected fellow at the International Society for Science and Religion. He specializes in the cosmological argument, the resurrection, and broader themes in Christian philosophy and theology, as well as science and religion. Thank you so much for coming onto the channel, and I can't wait to discuss the resurrection during this special time of the year. So to get started off, what got you into the resurrection?
Well, it is one of the most significant events in history, and it has huge implications, right, for all humanity, given that it concerns the overcoming of the biggest problem of humanity, which is death. Because we know that all of us are going to die one day, and so is there life after death, right? So this is a big question, a big issue that many of the greatest thinkers, philosophers, religious leaders have thought about. And the resurrection is very significant because it says that death can be overcome. And so if it really happened, right, then this is something that would give us hope of eternal life. And so I'm very interested in this topic, right? I want to find out more whether it really happened or not. And moreover, the resurrection is significant because of the religious context in which it happened. Because Jesus was not just some ordinary person. He is someone who is one of the most influential, significant person in human history. And he claimed to be divine. Right? So I've written 2 books about this that establish the claim that the historical Jesus did claim to be divine. And the resurrection of Jesus is supposed to confirm his claim. And so if that really happened, then that will be a good reason to believe that Jesus is really God. And if Jesus is really God, then he can tell us, right, what is the meaning of life. He can tell us what is the ultimate solution to the problem of evil. He can tell us what is going to happen to us after we die. And the Bible claims that God has given proof to all mankind that there is judgment after death. There's heaven, there's hell, by raising Jesus from the dead. And so if this event really happened, then we can be sure, right, that there's life after death, and we need to prepare for it. The other reason which I find this topic very fascinating is that the historicity of this event is still being defended in articles and books published by the top academic publishers, like Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, Routledge. These are the top publishers in the world. Now, you wouldn't find Oxford or Cambridge or Routledge publish books that claim that there's historical evidence that say Su Hu Gong exists. And we know that those are legends, those are myths, yes. Right? There's no evidence for those. But you will find that books, peer-reviewed journal articles, that shows that there is good historical evidence to show that Jesus truly resurrected. And I find this point very significant because a lot of skeptics, atheists, or agnostics, they fail to take note of this point. But it's a fact because I myself have published some of this, right? So I know this very well, right? So for example, this article published by Oxford University Press in the Journal of Theological Studies. So this is one of the top historical, critical, theological journals, right, on Christianity in the world. And so I have an article on the resurrection of Jesus in this journal. And I have this book published by Cambridge University Press on the origin of divine Christology, where I established that there's good historical evidence to show that Jesus claimed to be divine. And this is a very important background, right, for understanding the resurrection, which I also briefly addressed in this book as well. And then I elaborated on the resurrection in this book published by Routledge, right, that goes through all the naturalistic alternative explanations that skeptics have tried to explain away and the resurrection, right, and show that all these alternatives fail, and thereby establishing the resurrection as something that really happened in history. And then in this book, I responded to all the objections that people have raised against my previous publications to show that all of them failed, to rebut my argument. And then this is a popular level book, The Biggest Questions of Existence, where I also incorporated some follow-up articles on the resurrection, right, to show that it really happened. So these are arguments taken from peer-reviewed journal and monographs, right, that shows that the resurrection is a historical fact. And so this is something that is utterly unique when we compare religions. Because we know that all religions have something to say about life after death. But no founder of any other religion, right, there's no evidence to show that they actually overcome death, except Jesus. And this evidence is published in the top academic publishers in the world today, even after 2,000 years. Right? This is still being defended today. And so this is hugely significant, right, for all humanity, right, to know about this, because it provides us the hope of eternal life.
Yes, I think that's one of the things which makes the resurrection argument stand out. Not only makes Christianity stand out. I mean, in your book, you talk about some of the experiences of your engagements with some Buddhists and some people of other religions, where they look at the Christian argument for the resurrection and they're like, this is something special, it's something unique, it's something which has not been done anywhere else. And I suppose developing on that point then, what makes this Christian argument for the resurrection almost different or unique to other arguments in natural theology, because in this series we've been talking about the cosmological argument. Check out that video with Dr. Andrew Loke. We've talked about fine-tuning arguments. These can in some sense be applied to the Muslim. The Muslim could use these arguments. The Christian could also use these arguments. The Jew could also use these arguments. But for the resurrection it is something different. So can you tell us a bit more about what makes this argument stand out?
So one immediate response to your question is that the resurrection of Jesus stand out as something that is unique to Christianity. Because as you mentioned just now, the cosmological argument, teleological argument, now those arguments are important because it shows that we can know that there is a God on the basis of this reason and evidence, and there is somebody up there which transcends the natural world. And therefore, this increased the plausibility of miracle, right? Because given that such a God exists, of course, right, if he can create the universe, he would be able to do miracles as well. He would be able to raise somebody from the dead, right? That wouldn't be difficult for him, right? If he can create the whole universe. And so these arguments are important for setting out the background. But the resurrection is unique because it is specific, right, to Christianity. Now, as I said earlier on, no founder of any other religions is able to overcome death. So this provides good reason for us for thinking that the God who transcends the universe, the God who created the universe, has revealed himself in a special way in the person of Jesus in human history to tell us how we can connect with God.
I think that's quite interesting that it has a different methodology. And in natural theology, it's often more of an abstract argument. I suppose it's based on what we observe, but it's still arguing about causation. It's arguing about fine-tuning parameters of the universe, and someone who's a layman might look at this and say, this is somewhat beyond over my head. But when it comes to a case of, I suppose, history or science, we engage with this in a bit more common aspect, in the sense of, I see water boiling at 100 degrees, I have some understanding of science. I read my book about Julius Caesar, I have some understanding about history. Can you tell us a bit more about that kind of historical and scientific methodology?
Yes. Yeah, so you're right in the sense that the resurrection argument is also more concrete in that sense, right? And even a layperson reading the Bible can read about it, the story about his resurrection. And the resurrection argument shows that this story is true, right? So it's very concrete and real to people in that sense. And so I also find the resurrection argument powerful in that, significant because of that as well. Now, you're right also to point out that the methodology that is involved in the argumentation involves historical and also scientific reasoning as well. It involves historical reasoning in the sense that we need to analyze the documents that talks about Jesus' resurrection historically critically, right? How can we know whether what it says is true or not, right? So we need to apply the method of historical analysis to apply it to the New Testament and to discern whether what it says about resurrection is true or not, right? So we use that methodology. But it also involves science as well, using science to exclude the naturalistic alternative explanations. So for example, some skeptics have argued that, well, perhaps what the disciples experience can be explained away using, say, for example, hallucination theory. But there's good scientific evidence that shows that it's unreasonable to think that hallucination can explain a group of people having experience of seeing somebody there when in fact there's nobody there. Right?
Yes.
So we can use scientific reasoning, right, to exclude those naturalistic alternatives. Yeah.
And can you perhaps tell us a bit about the potential limitations of this historical scientific approach?
Yeah, so one of the limitations is that historical and scientific arguments, these are probabilistic. They don't give you 100% certainty. And unlike, say, for example, the ontological argument, if it's sound, it can give you 100% certainty. Although I myself have some reservation about the argument, but that's another story. Now, I do think that the cosmological argument is a sound argument, and I also think that the cosmological argument can give you 100% certainty, actually. So I've defended the soundness of the argument in the other video with you, so you can check it out. For the resurrection, it doesn't give you 100% certainty because, it involves historical and scientific and inductive reasoning. So there is that limitation. But nevertheless, it doesn't mean that just because it doesn't give us 100% certainty, therefore we can disregard it. That's obviously ridiculous, right? So for example, even though science cannot tell me 100% certain that gravity exists, right? But it would be ridiculous to disregard gravity, right? I mean, I wouldn't go out later and just jump down from 10 stories, right?
Yeah.
I'm not suicidal,
of course.
because I have very good inductive evidence,
Indeed.
inductive reason, right, for thinking that I'll probably die, right? So I wouldn't do such a silly thing, right? Likewise, historical facts can be very well established as well. So just now you mentioned Julius Caesar, right? That he crossing the Rubicon, right? This is something that is well established historical fact, and is something that historians wouldn't think that just because it's probabilistic, therefore I don't believe it, right? It would be stupid, right, to think that that's the case. So so therefore, what I'm trying to argue is that even though there's no logical certainty in the sense of 100% proof. But nevertheless, there are many examples of scientific certainties, like gravity exists, for example, right? And historical certainties, right? Even though these are not logical certainties, right? But these are certainties in the sense that there is such overwhelmingly good evidence to think that these are truths. It will be ridiculous to reject them as truths. And likewise, in my book, I argue that is also the case for Jesus' resurrection as well. It is a truth. It is something that really happened in history, and we can know it as such.
So perhaps we could develop upon this. We're now getting tantalizingly close to this argument for the resurrection that you provide.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit more about the methodology of your approach, especially when I think a lot of us probably watching this video, we've grown up with the minimal facts argument for the resurrection, with people, I think, like Gary Habermas and Mike Licona presenting it. But of course, now your approach does go beyond the minimal facts. So can you tell us a bit more about your methodology and how your argument differs from these approaches?
Concerning the minimal facts, I think that it is a good starting point for a conversation. So this Habermas appeal to these facts which are widely acknowledged by scholars, regardless of whether they are Christians or non-Christians. Even skeptics skeptical historians would generally concede that there are some facts about Jesus which are well established. And so it's a good point to start the conversation with people. But nevertheless, I don't limit myself to these facts. Rather, I follow the reason and the evidence. So if I think, for example, that there is good reason and evidence to establish certain other details in the Gospels, say, for example, that God's in the tomb. I mentioned this in chapter 6 of my book, Investigating the Resurrection of Jesus Christ. Right? So in chapter 6, I argue that there is good reason for thinking that there are really gods at the tomb. Even though this is not something that is widely accepted among skeptical scholars, but nevertheless, they have not rebutted my arguments for this. Right? So I would also use such arguments to complement the minimal facts and to be part of the cumulative case for establishing the resurrection as something happened. Now, the other way in which my approach differs from Habermas and Licona and others is that I use a strictly rigorous deductive framework to frame the argument for Jesus' resurrection. I use the argument for exclusion. I use the law of excluded middle, right, either A or not A, to formulate the resurrection argument in such a way that we can exclude all the possible alternatives and arrive at the resurrection as something that truly happened. So given that this argument is deductively valid, if the premises are true, and I said just now, we don't need 100% certainty to recognize something as true, right? So if there's strong probabilistic reason for thinking that premises are true, and we recognize it as true, then the conclusion will be true as well, right? The conclusion follows deductively from the premises. And so this makes the argument stronger, right, compared to the way that it has been defended by other scholars.
And I think that is one of the aspects which stood out to me when I was reading your book, is very much the fact that it goes through this deductive framework with this law of the excluded middle to really get to, well, how do we know that Jesus' resurrection is the most reasonable thing? And if someone rejects that, then they have to actually go back through that framework and say, well, okay, this is the area where I object to it. So perhaps to get into the argument, now that we've kind of set the groundworks for it, can you tell us a bit more about this deductive framework that you provide, so then we can perhaps specify or jump into any specific aspects of this framework?
So I provided two deductive arguments in my book. One concerns the resurrection appearances, the other concerns the empty tomb. Because we are short of time, maybe we'll just focus on the first one. Right? So for the first argument, as I said earlier on, I use the methodology of historical critical analysis and also scientific evidence, together with the approach of analytic philosophy. Right? So it's a transdisciplinary approach in that sense. Right? So I use analytic philosophy to discuss what are the essential characteristics of various alternative explanations, and then using these results to formulate a deductively valid arguments to show that Jesus' resurrection happened, and then use historical and scientific considerations to establish the premises and thereby establish the conclusion as true. So the deductive argument goes like this. Now, premise one, either there were groups of people in the first century who claimed that they saw the resurrected Jesus, or they weren't, right? So either there was such group of people who make such a claim, or there were no such group of people, right? So if there were such group of people, then premise two, now either these people who claim that they saw Jesus resurrected, either they didn't experience anything, they didn't see anything, they make up the story, they told a lie, or they did see something, right? So if they did see something, then premise three, either these people what they saw is something that is caused by something inside their mind. So intramental hypothesis, like hallucination theory or hysteria. They believed that they saw something when in fact they didn't see anything, right? So this intramental hypothesis, or it is caused by something outside their mind. And I call this the extramental hypothesis, right? There is something outside their mind that they really saw. Just as I'm seeing you now, right? You are outside my mind. Right? I'm not just dreaming about you, right? So if it's caused by something outside their mind, then either, premise 4, either this something is something else rather than Jesus. Maybe they mistook another person for Jesus, or mistook another phenomena they saw as Jesus himself, or it was Jesus himself, right? It was the body of Jesus that they saw alive. Okay? Now, if it was the body of Jesus whom they saw alive, then premise 5, either this Jesus didn't die on the cross earlier, or he did die on the cross earlier. Right? So if he didn't die on the cross earlier, there are two possibilities, right? Either he wasn't crucified at all. Maybe the enemies of Jesus crucified the wrong guy. They crucified the wrong guy and Jesus escaped, right? And then 3 days later, he came out again and showed himself to the disciples. Hey guys, I'm alive. And they were all tricked to believe that he was alive, right? When in fact, he wasn't crucified at all. Or he was crucified, but he didn't die on the cross. Right? Maybe he just fainted on the cross. And then he was entombed, and then 3 days later, he revived and escaped from the tomb and showed himself to the disciples. Hey guys, I'm alive. And that's how they believed that he was resurrected. So there are these two possibilities, right? Either he wasn't crucified, or he was crucified, but he didn't die, right? Or he did die. Okay. So if he did die, then the conclusion is that the Jesus whom the disciples saw was the Jesus who did die earlier and was seen alive again later, which means that he resurrected. So if we analyze the case for Jesus' resurrection logically, we find that there are only these few possibilities, right? Either there was no such groups of people who claimed that they saw me alive. We call this the legend hypothesis. Or they make up the story, right? It was a false testimony hypothesis. Or they experienced something inside their mind, the intramental hypothesis. Or it was caused by something outside their mind, but it wasn't Jesus, right? The mistaken identity hypothesis. Or Jesus wasn't crucified, right? The escape theory, he escaped crucifixion. Or he was crucified, but he didn't die, which means that he's soon on the cross. Or he did die and resurrected, which means that he resurrected, right? So there are only these few possibilities. And as I go through my book, I think it's quite easy to show that all the other possibilities are implausible, right? And that's why I'm leaving the resurrection as something that really happened.
So out of these ideas, I guess if someone's looking in to defend this argument that you're presenting, what do you think are the key aspects in which they have to defend or they have to establish? I mean, you present this deductive argument, but do you think there are any particular aspects of this argument which are, I suppose, might pose particular challenges for someone trying to defend this argument, assuming they're a philosophical layman, or whether they're all relatively kind of equally as easy or commonsensical to get their heads around?
Well, I do think that the layperson do need to have some understanding of the historical evidence concerning the case of Jesus' resurrection. So I think the philosopher will need to read up something, right, about the historical aspects of it. Say, for example, how do we know that there are already such a group of people in the first century who claim that they saw Jesus alive? If we get ourselves informed about the historical data concerning this, we will find that, say, for example, there are thousands of ancient Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, right, which indicate that the details concerning that there were such groups of people in the first century who claimed that they saw Jesus alive. This detail wasn't added into the Bible hundreds of years later, right? As what Da Vinci Code claims. So to answer your question, right? So I think the author of Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown, I think he's ignorant about history. He didn't know about the historical fact that there are all these ancient manuscripts around. And therefore, no historian agree with him, actually. No non-Christian, not even non-Christians, right? Even the most skeptical atheist historians would acknowledge that there are these ancient manuscripts which indicate that Jesus' resurrection, right, for example, was not something that was invented and inserted into the Bible hundreds of years later. But it can be traced all the way back to the first century, to the beginning of Christianity, right? At the very earliest history of Christianity, there were already documents that, say, for example, the four Gospels, letters of Paul, which claim that there are groups of people who saw Jesus alive.
Yes. I suppose concerning this, it might come up, and this is an argument that a lot of skeptics like to present, is to say, well, all right, the arguments and the evidence we're using are still very Christian in nature, and they don't rely on, or they say there's no other non-Christian evidences for the resurrection of Christ. What would you say in response to someone who is trying to, I guess, push back on the idea that we can use these Christian manuscripts as evidence, instead of just saying, well, all right, there are other aspects outside of Christian sources like Josephus, I suppose, Tacitus and Suetonius and things like that. But they might say, well, all right, those are too little. We cannot really base our arguments. And since we cannot base our arguments on Christian manuscripts, then we just have nothing to base our arguments on. What would you say to a skeptic with these arguments?
Yeah, so there are a few things which I would like to say. The first is that, well, actually, those so-called Christian documents, like, say, for example, letters of Paul, right? Now, we need to note that Paul was a former non-Christian. So the reason why he converted to Christianity was because he was also one of the eyewitnesses of Jesus resurrected, right? He also saw something that convinced him that Jesus was alive, was resurrected, right? So he was one of the eyewitnesses as well. And so, given that that is the case, then of course, right, the document that he wrote will be a Christian document, right, because he was convinced by evidence, right? So you cannot just dismiss it, right, just because it's a Christian argument, right? Rather, you need to investigate what is it that convinced him, and not only him, but others as well, the other disciples, right? So we can say that the other disciples, essentially, they have all become non-Christians after Jesus was crucified. They have all become so disillusioned, right, so hopeless. They didn't really believe that Jesus would be resurrected, right? But in the end, they were all convinced. And then they and their co-workers wrote down the other documents, say, for example, the Gospels, right? And that's why these are Christian documents, right? Because they were convinced, right, by the evidence, right? And so we need to, we must be careful not to put the cart before the horse, right, so to speak, right? But to look deeper at what is it that caused the writing of these documents in the first place, rather than just simply dismiss them, right, by saying that, oh, these are just Christian documents. They'll be guilty of superficial thinking. So that's the first point. And the second point is that we cannot just simply dismiss the claims in these documents just because they are Christian documents. Rather, we need to think about what possible ways could the claim be false, right? So if you say, I don't believe it because it's Christian documents, there are why do you not believe that is true, right? What are the possible ways it could be false, right? And there are only those few possible ways which I listed in just now in my deductive formulation, right? Either all the disciples lied about this, right? That's why it's false, right? No, they make up the story, or no, they saw hallucination or mistaken identity, etc., right? Or Jesus didn't actually die; he escaped, or it was a soon hypothesis. And there are no other possibilities, right? There are no other possible ways in which the claim could be false. And therefore, if we can exclude those possible ways in which it could be false, we can still establish it as the conclusion as true, even if it's written by Christian, right, or non-Christian. So whether it's written by Christian or non-Christian, it doesn't affect the validity or the soundness of the argument at all. And we still have to follow the argument evidence and accept the conclusion that Jesus resurrected as the truth.
And you've presented, I suppose, some of these alternative hypotheses. I suppose swoon theory, someone stole the body, perhaps, or these alternative explanations. Now, each individually, someone could say, okay, that's a very unlikely hypothesis. But you do raise in your book, well, what's about a combination of these alternatives? If you put together, okay, maybe it was a swoon theory, maybe it was a hallucination, all these factors get put together, would that increase the probability of the non-Christ resurrected hypothesis to a degree which is a significant challenge to your argument?
Yes. So in chapter 7 of my book, Investigating the Resurrection of Jesus Christ, right, I discussed the combination hypothesis in detail. Right? So the combination hypothesis is basically saying that, okay, hallucination may be unlikely by itself, okay, to explain group appearance. But perhaps the hallucination only affect individual, like Paul, for example. Maybe Paul suffered hallucination. But for the group, it may be caused by other things. It may be caused by mistaken identity, for example. Right? So this is one way that skeptic can try, right, to make their objections stronger by using a combination, right, using some hypothesis to explain some data, but using other hypothesis to explain other data, right, to avoid the force of the argument. Now, in my book, I address this objection by showing that there is some essential characteristic to the data and also to the hypothesis that render this combination hypothesis unworkable. So for example, right, I don't think that the experience of the 12 disciples can be explained away by mistaken identity. Why? Because the 12 disciples are people who knew Jesus well, right? They followed him for 3 years, lived with him. So it's unreasonable to think that they all mistook somebody else as Jesus. Right? That doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Right? Moreover, these disciples, we need to understand the historical context of earliest Christianity as well, where we know that the earliest Christians were being persecuted. And the resurrection is something that is foundational to their faith. They know that if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then there's no point believing in him, right? No point giving up their lives to die for him, right? And moreover, right, for these earliest Christians, they were ancient Jewish monotheists as well. Right? So for them, only the God who created the universe deserved to be worshipped. So if they were to worship somebody, a human being, a mere human being as God, this would be blasphemy. Right? This would be guilty of blasphemy. You'll be condemned by God in hell. Right? So nobody will be willing to die for something that they know is false and to go to hell for what they know is false. It doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah.
We know that there are Islamic terrorists, for example, who are willing to die for their faith.
Yes.
And that's because they believe is true, right? So a lot of people in history will be willing to die for what they believe is true, even though that may not be true. But you wouldn't find groups of people who will be willing to die for what they know is false and to go to hell, right, for what they know is false. Therefore, these disciples must have seen something that convinced them, right? It couldn't be something that they made up, right? And they must have seen something, and this something could not be explained by hallucination, as I said earlier on, right? It's unreasonable to think that a group of people see something when there's actually nothing there, right? And it's also unreasonable that they mistook another person for Jesus, right? Given that Jesus was somebody that was familiar to them, and also given the circumstances I explained earlier on, right? That there were persecution and the danger of blasphemy. They would have checked carefully to make sure that it was Jesus before they believed that it was Jesus, right? They wouldn't anyhow believe that he rose from the dead, right?
Yeah.
And then die for it, right? It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And so for all these reasons, those hypotheses can be excluded, right? Yeah.
So that's a very good argument, I think, in response to these alternative hypotheses. But I suppose someone might still look at this and say, well, all right, we don't have very good evidence for these alternative hypotheses, reasons to doubt them, but still to posit the resurrection as a historical fact might come to some skeptics as a supernatural explanation, which they might feel uncomfortable. And this, I suppose, goes back to David Hume's kind of historic argument against miracles, which has led to a lot of debate. And I was wondering, well, what can we say as Christians, and also as historians and scientists, I suppose, to stay within this historical scientific framework, to say, well, how can we allow for this, I guess, quote-unquote, supernatural explanation as a possible alternative if we are dismissive of these naturalistic alternatives?
Yes. So I discussed this issue in great detail in chapter 8 of my book, so the audience can take a look at this, because I don't think we have time to cover all the objections that Hume and other skeptics have raised. But basically, in chapter 8 of my book, first of all, I clarify what is a miracle, right? For many people like David Hume and also scientist Stephen Hawking, right, they think that a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and that is another reason why they don't believe it, right? Because they think that the laws of nature cannot be violated. However, in my chapter, I explained that a miracle does not have to be understood as a violation of laws of nature. Rather, it can be understood as an event that is caused by something that is other than natural causes. Okay. So, for example, let me give an illustration. So, if I let go of this water bottle, it will drop. That is a law of nature. Now, if I hold on to the water bottle, am I violating the laws of nature?
No.
No, right? The law of nature is still there, right? But the reason why it doesn't drop is because there's another force interfering. That's why it doesn't drop. Now, suppose God hold on to this water bottle, right? God hold on to this water bottle. Now, that would be a miracle, right? It will be something that is caused by God. Would that be a violation of the laws of nature?
No.
Again, no, because the law of nature is still there. But the reason why this does not drop is because there is a cause that caused it not to drop.
Yes.
Right? And this cause is something other than natural causes. Right? And so a miracle doesn't have to be understood as a violation of laws of nature. Rather, it's an event that is caused by something other than natural causes. So unless we assume that causes other than natural causes do not exist. Now, this will be a circular argument, right, against the existence of God,
Yes.
right? Assuming that there's no God, therefore there's no miracle, therefore there's no God, therefore there's no miracle. This is a circular argument. You'll be begging the question. So otherwise, so unless we make such a fallacious move, right? Otherwise, we should accept that miracles are possible, right? And the second thing is that we can also bring in the arguments of natural theology as well. So just now I mentioned that there is good arguments of natural theology, say for example the cosmological arguments, which establish that there is a first cause of creation of the universe. And so given that we can show that such a God exists, we can also show that miracle must be possible as well, right? Because such a God will be able to do miracles in history. Yeah.
So perhaps looking at this beyond this human objection, is there any evidence that someone could potentially raise in the same way we look at the swoon hypothesis and say, okay, there's reasons to doubt that, mistaken identity, there's reasons to doubt that. Has anyone presented any actual arguments against the resurrection hypothesis as a possible explanation, I suppose, on purely historical and scientific grounds without this, I suppose, appeal to this circular appeal to miracles or whatnot? Has anyone actually gone to the resurrection hypothesis and said, well, there's some reasons why this does not work?
Well, some people have argued that if you go by historical arguments, so you mentioned about history and science just now, right? People will argue that, well, we haven't observed anybody raised from the dead yet. So on the basis of inductive argument, right, they will think that it is very unlikely that Jesus resurrected from the dead. And so this will be a probabilistic, historical, scientific argument or evidence against his resurrection, right, based on our inductive experience. So some people have tried to disprove the resurrection using such arguments. But again, I don't think that it works. The first thing to note is that those scientific and historical arguments only work for describing events of the natural world when the natural world is left to itself. So we all agree that if God doesn't intervene, then it's very unlikely that somebody will raise from the dead, right? But the resurrection event is not supposed to be such an event, right? It's not supposed to be a natural event. It's supposed to be an event that is caused when the natural world is not left on itself. And therefore, we shouldn't use that kind of inductive arguments, right, against the resurrection. So let me give you another illustration, right? So now, prior to the 9th century, based on the inductive reason, right, that they will say that, it's very unlikely that somebody can fly in the sky. But then in the 9th century, there was somebody in the Middle East, I can't remember his exact name, right, who invented a kind of artificial wings, right, used natural material to make something, and then he jumped off the cliff, and he was able to fly for a while, right? So should we argue that, because of our past experience, we are not going to believe that this happened? Now, it will be unreasonable. Now that there was eyewitness, actually, somebody actually saw this, right? So are we going to discount the eyewitness evidence? No, it will be unreasonable. Why? Because the fact that people could not fly in the sky unaided shouldn't be regarded as evidence against the claim that somebody did fly in the sky aided by the wings, right? So with the help of the wings, he could fly. So likewise, the fact that people wouldn't be able to resurrect from the dead naturally shouldn't be, the evidence for that shouldn't be used as an evidence or argument against the claim that somebody did rise from the dead with the help of God, right? With the aid of God, divine aid, right? With the help of God. And so I think that this inductive argument doesn't work. Okay. And so the second thing I want to add is that, and therefore, right, to consider whether something is just happened as a result of natural world left on its own or not left on its own, we need to consider the historical context, the religious context. This is very important. So as I said earlier on, right, Jesus is not just any other normal human being, right? He is somebody who is very unique and also make some unique claims about himself, right, in a very significant religious context. So given this context, and also given the evidence for his resurrection, and also given the fact that we can exclude other possibilities, we have good reason for thinking that this is a miracle that happened. This is not just a normal historical event, not just an event that is a natural event, right? But because of the context in which Jesus predicted that he will raise and make this as, he claimed that to be God, right? And plus the evidence, plus the fact that we can exclude other alternative explanation, we have good reason to believe that this is a miracle. And therefore, we should not use arguments about how the natural world operates on its own when it's left on its own, right? To argue against this miracle. It is invalid to do so.
That's a very good response to these objections. And now that we have this very powerful deductive argument laid out and we have a very good response to these objections, perhaps to slowly wrap up this interview, what are the frontiers of the resurrection argument literature? Because, you know, we grew up, I suppose, as I noted previously, on minimal facts. You've presented this new, more deductive, more long-form argument than the minimal facts argument. Where do you see this debate on the resurrection going, perhaps in the next 10 years, or what's going on?
Yeah. So right now, the frontier of the discussion is that many skeptics would acknowledge that many of those naturalistic hypotheses simply cannot work, right? So the legend hypothesis cannot work, right? The false testimony cannot work as well. So now the only remaining hypothesis that skeptics are still trying to defend, and which is published in peer-reviewed literature. Right? I'm not talking about some blog posts or, published by anybody, right, who is not well trained, right? I mean, of course, anybody can write anything on those blog posts, right? But in the serious academic discussion, the only hypothesis that is still being seriously defended other than the resurrection is the intramental hypothesis, right? And also sometimes used in combination with the illusion hypothesis as well, which is one form of mistaken identity hypothesis. So, for example, some skeptics claim that there is mass hysteria, and the strongest case that they have presented is the Marian apparition. Say, for example, the case at Zaitun. There are skeptics who think that Mary's apparition at Zaitun, that is a mass hysteria. That is an illusion, because Mary, the so-called Mary, didn't speak, right? And he wasn't touched, right? So it looks like something like an illusion, right? Not like a real person who can speak and who can be touched, right? And so some skeptics think that that is an illusion, a mass hysteria, an illusion, and they think that maybe the resurrection of Jesus can be explained away similarly as well, right? Because illusion is something that can be seen by a large group of people, and so this can also explain how is it that the case of Jesus' resurrection appearances, how this can be seen by a group of people. So that is the frontier of the discussion right now, right, on such hypotheses. Right. Now, in my peer-reviewed journal articles, which is summarized in this book, I address this hypothesis, actually. I show that it suffers from similar problems which I have already laid out in my earlier books on the resurrection. Now, this kind of intramental hypothesis and illusion hypothesis, they have some essential characteristics to them which suffer from the same problems. Okay. Now, the first problem is that, okay, so let us think about the case of the Marian apparition, right? I think there are two ways to respond to this. The first way to respond to this is that, well, somebody can argue that this is a genuine miracle, as many Roman Catholics have done, and Cameron tried to present the case for it as well, arguing that no, there's no good natural explanation for this phenomenon. And so, if it can be shown that this is a genuine miracle, then the skeptics cannot use this, right, as a counter example to explain away the resurrection, right? That wouldn't work, okay, because it's not a mass hysteria in that case, right? It's not an illusion in that case. It's a genuine miracle, right? On the other hand, if skeptics can explain this away, show that it is not a genuine miracle, then Christians can reply by saying that now the strongest argument for thinking that this the Zaitun case is not a miracle is what I said just now, right? That Mary wasn't experienced as speaking, right, or being touched.
Yeah.
But when we look at the case for Jesus' resurrection, that is not the case. When we look at the case for Jesus' resurrection, we have multiple independent, attested, well-preserved traditions, which shows that Jesus spoke to people on multiple occasions. The resurrected Jesus, right? He spoke to people, and that he was touched by the disciples on multiple occasions as well. Okay, and so it'll be disanalogous, right? And so we cannot use the case of Zaitun to explain away Jesus' resurrection. Again, it doesn't work as well. So either way, it doesn't work. Right?
Yes. No, that's definitely very fascinating. And I suppose to wrap up this interview, what are some books that you would recommend people to go to learn more about it? You've referenced this book a lot. I think, if I remember correctly, it's an open access journal, so you can find it on your academia.edu page.
Yeah.
So that's definitely a very good place. I'll put a link to that in the description below. But can you tell us a bit more if people want to get further in depth, maybe into the peer-reviewed articles or whatnot? Where can people go?
Yes, there's also another very good book that recently published by Routledge. It's written by David Gregg, and it's called Resurrection Remembered. And of course, there are other classics like recent books by Gary Habermas. He has published huge volumes, right? Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3, Volume 4, right? Going through meticulously all the historical details. So even if we may not agree with everything he says, but that doesn't discount the fact that there are a lot of valuable information in those books as well. And also books by Michael Licona, and also a book by Sean McDowell, and also books by Dale Ellison. Again, I don't agree with everything he says. I have books that respond to Dale Ellison here. Right? That in this book, I pointed out some flaws in Dale Ellison's argumentation. But that doesn't discount his whole book altogether. I mean, there's valuable things in his book as well. In fact, he did agree at the end of the day that the case for Jesus' resurrection is something that is utterly unique, without parallel. He did say something like this in his book as well. And he established it too. And then there's a book by N.T. Wright, The Resurrection of the Son of God. It's a classic book. So I would encourage the audience to check out all these publications. There's a wealth of material there, right, that defends the historicity of Jesus' resurrection and show why this is so unique, right, among world religions. Why there's such good evidence for thinking that this is an event that truly happened, and it provides us the real hope for eternal life.
Yes, I think that's a very good place for people to start and to get into further research if they want to go. I mean, if someone wanted to go through N.T. Wright's writings, that would take them, or Gary Habermas' writings, that would take them up for absolutely forever.
Pages, that's right. Start my book. So the readers start this one. This one has a one-chapter summary, which presents the cutting edge of the debates. Right. So it also summarizes a lot of good arguments from all these scholars I mentioned earlier on, and also include my deductive framework in this book as well. So it will give the audience a good way to start getting into the case for Jesus' resurrection.
Wonderful. Well, so I'll make sure to put Dr. Andrew Loke's academia.edu page in the description below. Thank you very much for coming onto the channel. I really appreciated it. Stay safe. See you soon. Thanks for watching, and goodbye. I'll see you next one.